Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Witold Gombrowicz is our subject for today, and we'll be thinking about his struggle for authenticity in the face of artificiality, his idea of immaturity, what he called the interhuman church, his conflict with Polish nationalism, expressed as a dichotomy between the fatherland and what he dubbed the sonland, and his openness about gay desire in a closeted era. As I was sitting on my balcony preparing for this week's conversation, I found myself sitting with three versions of Gombrowicz's most challenging novel, Trans-Atlantyk, written in the style of a 17th century memoir. I had the original Polish text, the translation by Carolyn French and Nina Karsow, and the newest translation by Danuta Borchert. I thought it's interesting that Yale University Press keeps both these translations in print, demonstrating how far we've come in seeing the translator not as an invisible machine, but as an interpreter who gives us a window onto the original, and as a kind of actor who draws on personal experience to impersonate the primary author, producing a new text in the author's name. Gombrowicz loved the perspective of the balcony, to look out at the world with his binoculars, and he also loved it as a rhetorical stance, as if he were addressing a crowd in his writing. He was often photographed standing on a balcony, and I'm fortunate to live in a warm climate, so maybe I have an ideal space to be reading Gombrowicz. As I was comparing these three editions, I might sometimes get hung up on some phrase, maybe not even an important one. For instance, in Borchert's translation, there is a line from a folk song that she renders as, "Pawn your breeches, spread your peaches." And not remembering it particularly from the original, I was wondering what Gombrowicz could have said there, and I found something kind of different, but with a similar meaning. Zastaw się, a postaw się. And I'm tempted to digress here about shades of meaning and verb roots and aspects and reflexive forms and what I found in various dictionaries and about articles I turned up on the internet by searching for this very phrase because it appears in other contexts. But that would take the whole hour. So let me cut to the chase and say that I was able to find in the second edition of the Kościuszko Foundation Dictionary, which is excellent for idiomatic expressions, that zastaw się, a postaw się means show off at any cost. Maybe in English we'd say, shake it for all it's worth. So maybe my potential for distraction makes me kind of a slow reader sometimes, but I figure what's the rush? I've always told students to look stuff up, and that insights often come from asking questions and following the answers wherever they may lead. That's research. Maybe this digressive form of reading isn't always what the author wanted, and it's almost certainly not what American editors want after they've done their best to make the manuscript smooth and streamlined. But I think of it as reading in three dimensions, not just to find the most direct route to the last page of the book, but to stop along the way and find some of the things that may have been in the writer's mind even without their knowledge. So before we meet our guest, let me thank you all, our enthusiastic viewers who are following our series, spreading the word, and subscribing. If you check the YouTube description down below, you can find our playlist. And as it fills out, you'll see that we're adding new topics. And if you like what you hear, click the thumbs up down below and leave us a comment if you can. If you haven't already done so, please hit the subscribe button and show our sponsors at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, that you are interested and want to see more of what scholars, critics, translators, and eventually authors, I hope, have to say about Polish literature, its history, and its present. Let me introduce my dear friend and guest, Professor Bożena Shallcross from the University of Chicago. Bożena Shallcross is a professor of Polish literature and Polish-Jewish cultural studies in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Chicago, as well as an essayist, translator, and art critic. She has published several monographs, edited and translated volumes of texts by various authors, as well as numerous articles in which she has explored an intersection of the once fundamental division between the seeing subject and the objectual sphere in literature, the visual arts, and the phenomenal world, the world as it exists in our mind. Her research has taken her from the late stage of Polish symbolist poetry and its ekphrastic reassessments of Western European visual arts to the late modernist destabilization of the poetic subject and art-object divide, which she explores from the perspective of post-sublime encounters, the scene of writing, and spatial modes of habitation. Currently, she is working on 2 book-length projects: a study on the Kulmhof am Meer survivors, and a volume on inscriptions. Among her grants, fellowships, and awards, she appreciates most the Polish government's award for outstanding achievement in promoting Polish culture in the world, awarded in 2002. Welcome, Bożena.
Welcome, David.
Witold Gombrowicz, who had been born to a wealthy family of the Polish gentry, published his first collection of stories, Memoirs of the Time of Immaturity, in 1933, which was republished in an expanded version under the title Bacacay, after a street in Buenos Aires during the thaw of 1957, and which has been translated by Bill Johnston for Archipelago Books. After writing his first major novel, Ferdydurke, in 1937, he was invited to travel as a writer on the maiden voyage of the ship Chrobry, named after Bolesław the Bold, which was a tourist ship, and he ended up in Buenos Aires. Maybe you could say a few words about that.
That was indeed a crucial point in his life, as it coincided with the invasion of Poland by the Nazi Germany. So the main event of the 20th century actually, in a way, is escaping him. He is in Argentina. He can return to Poland, but he decides to stay in Argentina. So he absolutely deliberately uses the condition known as exile. So we have, on top of many other exilic writers, this absolutely wonderful, if bizarre, Polish-Argentinian writer, a very hybrid phenomenon. He is in Argentina. He is really without means. For some time, he works in Banco Polaco. His colleagues in the bank say that he mostly was writing his fiction while sitting at his desk. But he was writing Trans-Atlantyk, and this is in a way a reinvention of his own story, of his own life narrative, that novel. The novel is absolutely wonderful. It's just crazily funny, but it is also a very serious novel, as he, in a novel, is satirizing the Polish immigration, as he is satirizing Borges, and also the one of the characters who is gay. So already we have a bunch of very serious problems thrown into that stew. It's one of his favorite words, stew of events in Trans-Atlantyk. He returns to Europe after his economic situation is a little bit better. He has a Ford Foundation grant, and this allows him to stay in Berlin, and that's how far he was able to go in terms of his return to East and Central Europe. He never really returned to Poland, but he was in Berlin, and he has his binoculars, and that's all what he could do. He could try to see Poland through his binoculars. So this already implies a gesture of distancing and self-distancing.
When he was in Berlin on his balcony, he was looking over into East Berlin. I spoke with Rita Gombrowicz about this once some years ago, and she said, that's, of course, I asked, so what was he doing with those binoculars on his desk? And she said, well, he was a voyeur, but really, she said that he was trying to see what was life like in that old world, and he realized he couldn't come back to his old life. He didn't know what really was happening in Poland. The world had been completely shattered by the war and communism. I think that's one of the fascinating things about Gombrowicz, imagining him in the bank, writing Trans-Atlantyk in this very strange pastiche of the 17th century Polish memoir. Who is this for, and what is he imagining will happen to it?
I think that he could imagine a virtual reader as some of his émigré friends in Argentina, in France. I know that he was very much interested in conquering, so to speak, book markets. And he made concerted efforts to be published in the United States and in France. Actually, that was a lifetime engagement of his, to be published in other languages than Polish. Although he was published in Polish, and actually at some point we have Trans-Atlantyk and Ferdydurke published and available. And then, of course, after the change of the political system, Gombrowicz is not anymore a persona non grata and a political enemy in Poland. But this happens long after his death. While his efforts to be published in the United States during his lifetime were not successful, he was translated into French, and he was, I think, a writer of whom the Parisian intellectuals, critics, other writers were very much aware of.
We know that there was an issue of Magazine Littéraire devoted to Gombrowicz, and we know that the first translations into English, which maybe we all had in this copy, they were translated from French and from German. Rather than, and fortunately now we have translations of many of the works directly from Polish, so they're better and more accurate than they used to be. Although they're some works like Trans-Atlantyk they're so open to interpretation that we have two translations into English directly from Polish that are very different from each other.
I believe that it is untranslatable, and we can only translators can approximate his linguistic acumen, but there are systemic differences. English doesn't have diminutives that Polish has, etc., etc.
Right. I mean, and to find the equivalent of the style of Trans-Atlantyk, which goes back to the Sarmatian style, the style of Jan Pasek and the 18th century memoir. Maybe I've always thought that the model for that would be something like Hakluyt's Voyages. This massive compendium of English travel narratives.
Pasek was quite mobile, but also we have to probably keep in mind Krasicki's The Adventures of Nicholas Wisdom that cover in the spirit of the 18th century travel writing, cover the voyage as a journey of self-discovery, and a journey during which the self achieves full autonomy, autonomy without which an authentic life is impossible. So that would be one of the literary models for Gombrowicz. But this is also the same can be said about Tadeusz and the wonderful image of Polish gentry during the partitions and just on the brink of Napoleon's invasion of Russia.
Maybe we should look at some of this remarkable language from Gombrowicz. Let's start from this one toward the beginning of Trans-Atlantyk, when Gombrowicz, the character Gombrowicz, who is called Gombrowicz like the author, lands in Argentina, and he doesn't have very much money in his pocket, and he's looking for any contacts he may have, and he finds a contact named Czechoslovsky, whom he knew from Poland. And he's asking him for some advice because Czechoslovsky has been there for a few years, or maybe maybe he can help him get a job or something like that. And he explains his difficult situation, and Czechoslovsky says, "I understand your dollar indeed. Over the ocean you cannot jump. I thus approve or do not approve of your decision, and you did well to stay here, or perhaps not so well." He says this, twiddling his thumbs, seeing then that he thus his thumbs twiddling, methinks, why are you twiddling thus? Wait till I twiddle back at you. And I too begin twiddling, and at the same time saying to him, is that your opinion, sir? And then he says, I'm not so foolish as to have an opinion these days, or not to have an opinion. But since you've stayed behind here, get thee to the legation forthwith, or don't get thee there, and present yourself there, or not present, because if you present yourself or not present, you run the risk of causing yourself a major aggravation, or not run such a risk. And then the character Gombrowicz says, do you reckon, sir? So that is kind of the wild, archaic style that he's writing in. Of course, if there was such a conversation, nothing like that happened. So why do you think he adopts this peculiar style?
Because it's really in the spirit of his whole program of rejecting a certain type of patriotism or even nationalism. So he goes back to the Sarmatian culture, to the 17th century Baroque literature and its ornate rhetoric, very often very Latinized. And he is trying to, in doing so, he is trying to mock a certain phase in Polish culture, which was in many ways very successful and very creative. In particular, the coffin portraits are considered the most original contribution of Polish visual arts into the world art. But he's really trying.
Maybe we should say a word about what those are. That there were that was a particular genre of Polish painting to paint portraits on coffins of the people inside them, and there's a large collection of them in the National Museum in Poznań. And we'll put a link in the website for the webpage for this episode, so you can see what. So our viewers can see what some of those rather austere portraits of very noble figures looked like.
Yeah, but very realistic. The coffin portrait does not reflect the abundance the abundant lifestyle of the gentry, and doesn't reflect the fact that they loved display. They loved the display of wealth, but there are other works that capture that display of wealth, and the fact that actually Poles were very much enamored with the Turkish fashion, with what was called even some times ago an Oriental type of fashion. He is using his great talent at parodying the Polish Sarmatian culture in the Transatlantic, but also in Ferdydurke. And we have a number of rituals which he is totally, I would say, deconstructing. He's showing their meaninglessness, their emptiness, the void behind them. So this ultimately reflects on his approach towards nationalism. As Eva Hoffman, in a sense, rightly points in Being Poland, in that anthology that was already a subject of your first encounter. She actually points out that Sarmatism was a sort of the essence of Polish culture. I am not for essentialism of any sort, but that comment tells us tells us about the ranking of Sarmatian literature and lifestyle in Gombrowicz's cosmos or K-cosmos.
Maybe it would be good to look at a small passage from Jan Pasek's Baroque memoir that displays the abundant style, this extravagance of the Sarmatians. This is a scene that Pasek is remembering from a campaign in Denmark, if I'm not mistaken. And he's describing the uniform or the costume that the members of his regiment would wear. And he said, the soldiers called upon the king, handsomely outfitted in veste peregrina. That's an example of the macaronic Latin that they would incorporate into their language as an example of a kind of extravagance. A jupon of drilling, kontush also of drilling, a jerkin made of cavalryman's vesting, German-style boots with high tops reaching nearly to the waist, the kontush, which is a kind of a robe, an oriental style of robe, from whence that short coat, wrongly called a Circassian coat, with the high boots and garters, did come into being. For it was we who were forced ex necessitate to create this outfit, having worn our coats short in those countries on account of the boot tops. So long are they, and wide. It would have looked a fright if a long coat were to bounce upon these broad boots, both front and rear. So he's explaining this, this kind of costume in the way that they as soldiers adapted it, and it sounds rather elaborate, but they also had practical concerns since they were riding on horseback and they didn't want their kontush and their jupon to get tangled up in their boots. And then he goes on beyond just the military account and says, that costume came into style then. Everyone forthwith had even the finest coats made short, and boots, though Polish, made with high tops, with garters which were studded with silver, gold, rubies, diamonds, whatever you could afford. And these coats were shortened to show off the garters, every one together seizing upon this fashion, even shoemakers and tailors. For such is our way in Poland. If you turn your coat inside out, people will be saying it's stylish. And so that style has a great vogue until it reaches the common folk. What don't I remember of ever-changing fashions in coats, hats, boots, swords, caparisons, and in all dress, both military and civil, even hairstyles, gestures, manner of walk and greeting. Lord Almighty, I could not write all of it down on 10 ox hides. The which is the summa levitas of our nation, wherefrom stems great depauperatio. So he's saying that he's making a little fun of how Poles would take this military costume and turn it into into fashion that they would wear at home, and he makes these long lists of the elements of the costume, which is very much part of the abundant style, or copia as it's called in literary criticism. And as a way of elevating this image, and this is something that Gombrowicz really picks up in. He likes lists, he likes litanies, even as early as Ferdydurke, but he goes crazy with it, I think, in Trans-Atlantyk.
This is one of his main strategies, to use an enumeration, a repetition, which actually is not really a repetition, a list, but actually the extent in which he is diversifying the genre of a novel by using other genres, by introducing other genres, is pretty skillful and impressive. Just in Transatlantic, we have the Bildungsroman in reverse, an anti-Bildungsroman, we could say.
The novel of education, for those who aren't literature scholars.
Information, education, yes. We have a letter, we have a novel that is a travelogue. And in Ferdydurke, we have even more of that generic diversification, because we have a treatise, we have quite a few letters, a diary, at least in the first chapter, the beginning of an allegory, and you just name it. So he is very skillfully utilizing various genres that I think make his writing more dramatic, more attractive. But that's really only a part of his narrative strategies. There are so many more. For example, if we could get back now to Ferdydurke.
Maybe we should give a little summary of what happens in Ferdydurke, so that people know who these characters are. So Joey, or Jujo in the Polish version, is a grown man, and he goes to visit his old school and to speak to his old professor, Professor Pimko, and suddenly he becomes drawn into the school, and he turns into a child again. He's infantilized. You use this expression that Gombrowicz uses, upupienie, which comes from originally from Insatiability, from Witkatz's novel. I found it there, but that he describes as a whole mode of life, and this is why he's using the diminutives that are always being mentioned. And upupienie comes from the word pupa, which means like is like a childish word for the buttocks, right? So it's it's like tushification. We mentioned this in our last discussion with Benjamin Paloff. We're talking about Gombrowicz and his connection to Witkatze, and he gets caught up in all kinds of childhood disputes, even though he's a grown man, and he's treated as a child by the other children. But there's something in that immaturity, as he calls it, that's more authentic. To get back to this issue of like finding authenticity in the face of rigidified form, artificiality, and all these things that we that obscure our true selves.
There are those very strange behaviors. Pimko seated absolutely, right? Joey was standing absolutely, or they were pulling grimaces. And so it's just a lot of that very characteristic for Gombrowicz bizarre behavior. And And this is very much related to certain mental states. So the characters are in doubt, they feel inauthentic, they are looking for the farm boy in themselves. Well, that's the narrator who's doing this. They are seized by a certain tension. They are seized by belittlement, kupienie, and so on and so on. And then comes, of course, the main concept, actually, who is the self in Gombrowicz's novels. And well, we could say that basically self, Dasein, is relational. It exists in a network of various other characters, of other people who really have a great impact on each other. And that is a conundrum from which one cannot escape. And that's the reason for Gombrowicz eventually formulating the concept of the interhuman church, where those relations create an interrelational self, a self that is not authentic.
At the beginning of his play, The Marriage, in his preface to the play, he says that each person is deformed by every other person. That's his, which is, you know, an idea he has as early as, I think he writes that, he's writing it already in 1946, I believe. So even, you know, but so it's a kind of a resolution, but it's one that he knows, like, from early on.
Of course, that's also Ferdydurke. Ferdydurke, and the fact that Joey is pulled out from the comfort of his home to other cultural, very stereotyped formations, such as school. Joey is resisting certain cultural forms, and one of them is definitely the young bloods, the Młodziak family, that incorporated and identified with a modernist lifestyle. Their life, their apartment is functionalist. They are engaged citizens. They are, in every sense of the word, behaving like an avant-garde of the nation. They are modernists per se. And of course, Joey, when he's amidst that family, he is very quickly aware that this is just an intensification of the form in this case of a certain modernist lifestyle and worldview. So he attacks and he deconstructs, he disassembles that very carefully structured lifestyle of his host and hostess. This takes him to the complete opposite, that creates one of the most wonderful tensions in the novel. And he always believed, Gombrowicz believed, that tension is the main effect in a creative product, but also it's the main ingredient for creation. So the tension is between the modernist urban lifestyle, and which is epitomized the best probably by the young schoolgirl, and and also that gentry lifestyle in the countryside. These are completely ossified, conservative, unchangeable types of a mode of living, of entertaining, of interacting with each other. And the form is overwhelming. It's really it's really dominant. And that's why in the end of the novel, when he escapes from the manor, he sees that huge sun on the sky, which actually turns to be a something else, and a pupa. So this tells us that at least for Joey, there is no escape from life that is dominated and structured by a cultural form, be it the school life or the bourgeois lifestyle that is sort of refashioned as modernist, or from his own background, the gentry lifestyle. They're all, in a sense, very quickly becoming ossified, and very quickly they ossify the self or frame the self.
One of the most quoted passages from Gombrowicz is a lecture by Pimko that exactly represents this kind of ossification in the sphere of Polish literature, which is our theme. So I like to touch on it. But he's speaking to the students about the great Romantic poets. And he's speaking about Juliusz Słowacki, who is one of the triumvirate of three great poets. And he says, "A great poet, remember that. It's important. And why do we love him? Because he was a great poet." A great poet he was indeed, which we all, everybody in Polish, knows as wielkim poetą był, that he was a great poet. And it's a line that you could hear almost anywhere. "You laggards, you ignoramuses, I'm trying to be calm and collected as I tell you this. Get it into your thick head. So I repeat once more, gentlemen, a great poet, Juliusz Słowacki, a great poet. We love Juliusz Słowacki and admire his poetry because he was a great poet. Please make note of the following homework assignment. What is the immortal beauty which abides in the poetry of Juliusz Słowacki and evokes our admiration?" But at this point, one of the students fidgeted and groaned. "But I don't admire it at all. Not at all. It doesn't interest me in the least. I read 2 verses and I'm already bored. God help me. How am I supposed to admire it when I don't admire it?" His eyes popped and he sat down, thus sinking into a bottomless pit. The teacher choked on this naive confession. "For God's sake, be quiet," he hissed. "I'll flunk you, Gałkiewicz," that's his name. "You want to ruin me? You probably don't realize what you've just said." Even though we can, we find all these, themes, it's a tremendously funny novel. I mean,
Yes. But of course, it's the point is not that Gombrowicz is attacking the idols of Polish literary Olympus. I think that the point is that he really cannot stand a sort of an affirmative criticism that still actually is present around as one of the approaches in our understanding of literature. An affirmative criticism was not his cup of tea. He was, first of all, he was too critical to accept that. And also, I think that there was too much doubt in him to ever belong to that group of thinkers. So, if I would try to read Gombrowicz's novels, I would think that there are a few axes. One is, of course, reading him as an author of philosophical novels. And what philosophy it is, well, basically performative. It is a philosophy that is construed through action and inaction. But we can also read him through that action between authenticity and artificiality, in which self-design is struggling to find a sense of existence, to use this very well-known phrase. But actually, for me, the most appealing, at least recently, approach to his novels would be through from the perspective of the queer literature. Now, Ferdydurke, I consider Ferdydurke to be a novel about the queer revolution, about the dismantling of the binary and gendering of culture, of literature, and about really abolishing the old order. Gombrowicz says at one point in Ferdydurke, look, here is the key to all my machinations in this novel. And the key is in that very strange tale, child runs deep in Philibert.
Yes.
And this is a story which makes very clear references to the French Revolution. So it starts in the in that hall for in that sport hall where the assembly of all states of the French society gather. They play ball.
Yeah, they're playing tennis, right?
Yes, tennis. Yes, and they, of course, at a certain point, through a deviation of actually a bullet, start the revolution. And the revolution is the changing of this, one would say, seemingly immortal order in which men are very gentlemanly and women accept their admiration. In that particular tale, which is actually an allegorical reading of the French Revolution, we have everything turned upside down, like in a carnavalized world. So men are actually riding women.
And maybe I should fill this in just because it sounds so strange. So what's happening is two characters are playing tennis, and then there's a naval captain or ship's captain in the stands who is following this tennis match so closely that he pulls out his pistol and he shoots the tennis ball as it's going over the net. But because the rules of the game are so fixed, the tennis players keep hitting, waving their rackets as if they're hitting the ball back and forth, even though there's no ball to hit. So it's kind of like an empty game. And emptiness is a thing that that Gombrowicz talks about a lot.
The bullet is actually flying further and hits another character in the neck. And so that's the moment when the bloodshed starts and the revolution is entering its, terror phase. So this is really a sort of an instruction or maybe a brief scenario of how revolutions happen. They happen when one element swerves. That's the idea taken from Lucretius, treated extensively by some scholars, Gombrowiczian scholars. But so that element swerves and the world completely changes. And so now we could hope that Ferdydurke, as a novel that is trying to revolutionize our very stringent gender model, would somehow do that. And yes, I would say that from the very beginning, we have attempts at prompting the queer revolution. And the farmhand, of course, is one of the main tropes in the process. And the last, of course, ossified cultural form of the gentry manner is an ideal stage to actually not only prompt the social revolution, the reversal of class order, but also of gender. Now, it's I think, one of the possible readings of Ferdydurke, and it goes on in Trans-Atlantyk.
I mean, in Ferdydurke, that scene, I mean, what happens is it's a clear example of, action and reaction, formation and deformation. I mean, that the bullet hits the character across the neck, and the the wife of the character wants to react and inadvertently causes a person sitting next to them to have an epileptic reaction, and this leads to a sequence of things that turn into this heap, this kupa, at the end, where the gentlemen are on their wives' backs, literally riding them like horses into this stadium, this tennis court, a completely sort of absurd situation. But that's how things work in Gombrowicz, that things degenerate in this way, that's the only way, it seems, out of these rigidified forms. And the farmhand that you mentioned is like kind of like an icon of authenticity, right? I mean, this is the character who's on the one hand the obscure object of desire of the narrator, but who also is unformed in a sense. Perhaps that's not even true that he's unformed, because of course everything exists in a context. So what is that? But seems to be, for Gombrowicz's purposes, not settled into some kind of rigidified form. The one like kind of an anchor of authenticity, I think.
Yes, that definitely. He at some point, that farmhand in the manor is represented as, I would say, a man straight from Rousseau. The original unspoiled self that actually has to be forced to reject, to disrobe himself from old prejudices and habits. And this happens actually. And there is a revolution. And we don't know whether the manor is, totally destroyed, but because the narrator, our Joey, leaves the scene. But we assume that it's the end of that very ossified form of life.
Yes, and you could see it as sort of like one of a sequence of duels in different places in Gombrowicz. I mean, you mentioned the one from this kind of the central plot device in Trans-Atlantyk, that there's this character Gonzalo, who is this flamboyantly gay man, and who's called the puto, the prostitute, the hustler, and he's he draws Gombrowicz, the character, into his circle. And there's this, really, if you think of it, for 1953, 1951 is when he started writing the novel. Trans-Atlantyk, like a really extravagant, kind of gay cruising scene in Buenos Aires, where they're cruising the urinals, and and things that you just didn't see represented in respectable literature of that period. It's a very closeted era. Whereas you might make an interpretive gesture to find that in Ferdydurke, in Trans-Atlantyk, it's totally unambiguous, I think. And Gonzalo finds himself in a dispute with another Polish émigré, elder gentleman. He's attracted to this gentleman's son, Ignacy, or Iggy as he's called, and is trying to avoid getting into a conflict until he can hold himself no longer, and he throws a mug at him, and then the gentleman Thomas has no choice but to fight a duel. So they plan this duel out, and they realize, well, what's he fighting a duel with this puto? Um, what kind of honor will that get him? And he reveals honor is this rigidified, ossified form, and so they decide to, well, what they'll do is the seconds will, will will hide the bullets, and they won't put the bullets into the pistols. They'll just fire them, and they'll fire them repeatedly, but no one will get hurt. And that's how they'll circumvent the rigidified form of the duel. And what's interesting is that this empty duel, that there's a set of rules, there's a structure, but there's no substance, because no one will get hurt. It's like the tennis match where they're, you know, flinging the rackets back and forth, even though the ball has been destroyed, and all kind of chaos is breaking out around them.
But there are also other cultural habits that we are entrapped in, and Gombrowicz is exposing. And one of them is the business of collecting art,
Mm-hmm.
which is deemed prestigious, very prestigious. And so in Ferdydurke, Gonzalo, who is affluent, very affluent, collects all sorts of art. And why does he do it? He does it to cheapen the collection. So he is countering the usual traditional narratives of collecting, which actually are based on the belief that a collection is adding to the value of the collected works, because it's curated, because it's one work speaks to another, etc., etc. And here we have the opposite, the cheapening and no curating. Actually, all those works, all those paintings, all those fancy works of craft are scattered around. They are in that chaos that is so important for Gombrowicz. It's one of his main imageries. Then we have the library, the book collection. Again, Gombrowicz goes against the main narrative. And Gonzalo's counter narrative in this case is that books have to be read. So a book only represents a use value for Gonzalo, and he wants the books to be used. He doesn't think of books as having other values, be it the value of pleasure of reading or knowledge. No, for him, a book is about reading. It's about being used. And of course, this is again totally ridiculed, because he hires people who sit on tops of heaps of books and read them. This is a wonderful, I would say, shot at some of our cultural institutions, such as libraries and museums and galleries and art collections. That's what Gonzalo is doing. He's really revolutionizing. In his estate, he's revolutionizing the world as we know it.
If I could read a short passage about his mansion, his estate, and for our readers, they think back about that passage from Pasek, where he listed the litany of all the different parts of the costume, the kontush and the jupan and the boots and so forth, and Thomas, Ignace, and Iggy, and Gombrowicz are entering this mansion, And the narrator, Gombrowicz, says, "I was astonished, and Thomas and his son were likewise astonished at the sight of the grand luxuries of the salons, of halls with their plafonds, parquet floors, terracottas, likewise wainscoting, oriels, columns, paintings, statues, further on, cupids and refectory tables, pilasters, tapestry, carpets, likewise palms, also vases, filigree urns of crystal and jasper, small caskets, baskets of Brazilian rosewood, chests, Venetian or Florentine boxes, likewise cast metal filigrees, and so on and so forth." I mean, it almost, I mean, it's almost to hear the sounds of the words, and then if you think about them, we wonder, what are these things doing together? And one thing that image brought to mind was, I remember your anthology, the home of the romantic artist, which you published in Polish, and one of the most striking images there is the museum house of John Sohn, which is this tremendously ornate collection of objects that just seem all to be crammed into kind of a room. But it's of a later era, isn't it? Than
yeah,
the Sarmatian era. Yeah.
Right. Yes, the century later. But collecting starts in terms of creating curio cabinets, collecting curiosities. That goes back to the 16th century.
Of course.
Yeah. So Gonzalo actually is still keeping two notions of the genre that he is, of course, subverting, and that's a library and a museum. And he is destroying them from within by using one of their main callings or missions. A mission of, collecting, to display, to give pleasure. Nobody is enjoying Gonzalo's collection. In fact, Gonzalo considers this as a kind of a problem to have so much. He is a pitiful owner of an immense accumulation of artworks. And also books. So it is not a satire about wealth, but it is a satire about consumption that makes us to consume books and artworks without the act of seeing or reading. Artworks seem to be, for Gonzalo, valueless.
They also stand as these institutions of the museum and the library as a symbol of the father and the fatherland, right? I mean, Gonzalo is the person who introduces this idea of the sunland, Sincizna. Gonzalo is saying to Gombrowicz, "Oh, don't worry about Thomas, don't worry about the duel and so forth." And why do you even care about that guy? Because Gonzalo is not part of this Polish emigre culture. And so the character Gombrowicz says, "I exclaimed forthwith, 'Be quiet, stop persuading me, because 'tis out of the question that I should be against the father and my country, especially at a moment like this,' he muttered." And that he muttered, Gonzalo muttered, "To hell with father and country.
Mm-hmm.
The sun, that's something that I understand. But what is the land of the fathers to you? Is it the land of the sons better? The Sincizna and the Ojczyzna, the fatherland and the sonland. Substitute the land of the sons for the land of the fathers. Then you'll see."
Who is Gonzalo? He's a deterrent. He's this colorful, beautiful tropical bird that appears in the middle of the constantly struggling émigré society. And he just turns everything upside down. He is showing them their own lack of significance and pushes the world as they know it to the brink of chaos. I think that moment is rather useful to point out to the way Gombrowicz is dismantling other cultural institutions in Ferdydurke. In Ferdydurke, where the school is totally valueless, family is valueless, the class structure is valueless. And so the sort of an idea that Gombrowicz is presenting to us through those two novels is, I would say, remarkably ambitious and remarkably outrageous. There has never been anything like this in Polish literature and world literature. And perhaps this is the reason why Gombrowicz is known only to a very selected group of readers. Something that I would personally not lament over, but it is true. And John Bailey years ago wrote in the New York Review of Books that it is, it is like a club of those who are initiated, those who read Gombrowicz. So it's almost like a secret society of those people who read him, appreciate him, and enjoy him.
Well, one thing that I mean is the goal of this this program, these discussions, and I think of what all of us do in in the field of education and at universities and so forth, is to make these figures more known, like Gombrowicz, so that more people can appreciate this remarkable literature in a part of the world that maybe not too many people have read, but that is as valid as anything else happening in the world. And maybe, like, on that note, you could say a few words about your program at the University of Chicago in Polish Studies.
Oh, thank you for this opportunity, David. So our program has a quite interesting lineage, as we had among its in the faculty such scholars like Samuel Sandler, Jakobson, Tamara Trojanowska, but we also had one writer who was not a scholar, Maria Konceviczova. But thanks to her presence in the faculty, we have a fund called Maria Konceviczova Fund that we use to organize all sorts of events on campus. And that really is extracurricular. That is, it adds to our curriculum. Just recently, we had a conference on the Polish American art in Chicago, and hopefully a book will come out as a result of that conversation. Among our faculty, we have currently a political scientist. We just hired a historian who is a specialist of Polish Jewish studies, in Polish Jewish studies. And we have a person who teaches language, and myself. And we offer at this point NMA, and hopefully since this fall, we will be also accepting PhD students.
Of course, Chicago is, as everyone knows, is the largest Polish city in the world after Warsaw, or that's what people say, because there's such a large Polish émigré community there, and they've endowed programs at different universities, and of course there's a local audience for Polish studies, but of course University of Chicago is a first-class university in the world, and I'm wondering though that given that there are also interesting programs at the University of Illinois Chicago and at Northwestern, is there a consortium that graduate students can study at the other institutions and because of
Jennifer Croft, the wonderful translator of Tokarczuk, among others, actually was a doctoral student at Northwestern, but was taking my course on Miłosz at the University of Chicago. And she was remarkable from the onset. She, for example, she wrote her paper in Polish. It was the only paper that a non-native user of Polish language has ever written for me. And I keep it, not to scare Jennifer, but to add a laurel to her wreath.
Jennifer will be our guest later this year when we have an episode about Olga Tokarczuk. Jennifer's recently translated her massive novel, the Books of Jacob. So we look very much forward to that. And that's all really quite wonderful about the program, and because as all of us know, like who Americans know who have been in the field of Polish studies, usually you go to university, and if you go there to study Polish literature or something, you've maybe got one faculty member to work with,
or none.
Or none. I mean, and so that's why I did like my master's degree and my doctorate at two different institutions, so I could work with at least two different people and maybe a few more along the way. But to be in a place like Chicago or New York, I mean, there are more options. Maybe there are more now in Chicago than in New York. When I was a graduate student, New York had more possibilities, but
unfortunately, the Polish studies in New York City are a bit in eclipse, but it will change. I believe that it will change. Your program is actually one of the ways to have a positive impact on that change.
Thank you. I hope we can raise some interest in these various programs and in Polish literature generally. And on that note, I should just remind everyone, if you like that mission that we have to expand Polish studies, or if you're just interested in reading about Polish literature, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our series. I'd like to thank, in addition to Bożena, Shallcross, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
We'll have you back again in the not too distant future. Maybe we'll talk about Stanisław Lem, which I would very much look forward to doing later this year. We should also thank the Polish Cultural Institute New York, directed by Robert Czaniawski, my good friend Bartek Remisko, who is the head of Humanities and Literature Programming at the Polish Cultural Institute, who suggested this series and who acts as our executive producer, our wonderful editor, Natalia Iudin, and fellow producer who handles all of the video editing, the technical and aesthetic aspects of our production. And Claudia Ofłona Draber, who is the head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, and keeps us all informed about all of the Institute's programs. In addition to this one, I would recommend check out the Institute's website and look at the series they're doing now on Krzysztof Penderecki, one of the greatest composers of the 20th century, certainly in Poland, and I would argue around the world. After recording this discussion with Bożena Shallcross, we learned of the unfortunate death on March 21st, 2021, of the great poet and essayist Adam Zagajewski, whose poem, Try to Praise the Mutilated World, I read in the prologue to the first episode of Encounters with Polish Literature just a few months ago. We were planning to discuss the work of Wisława Szymborska next month with Claire Kavanaugh from Northwestern University. But as it happens, Professor Kavanaugh is the leading English language translator of both Szymborska and Zagajewski. So we will reflect on the work of Adam Zagajewski in our next episode on May 1st, and we will save our thoughts on Wisława Szymborska for next year sometime. Be well, friends.